December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning sun shimmered off the calm Pacific, painting the water gold. On board the USS West Virginia, the galley was alive with the clatter of pans and the scent of frying bacon. Mess Attendant Third Class Doris Dory Miller, a 22-year-old from Waco, Texas, stood over a tray of eggs, humming to himself. He wasn't trained for combat. His duty was simple: serve meals, clean, keep the crew fed. Then came the sound that tore through paradise. A low roar growing, swelling until the very air trembled. Outside, sailors shouted, "Air raid! This is no drill." Dory dropped his ladle and ran for the deck. Above the harbor, black specks streaked across the sky. Japanese bombers, dozens of them, engines screaming as they dove toward Battleship Row. The first explosions ripped the morning apart. Columns of smoke rose like fists from the USS Oklahoma and Arizona. He froze for half a second, heart pounding. All around him, chaos: sailors scrambling for stations, officers barking orders drowned by the thunder of bombs. The West Virginia shook violently. A torpedo slammed into the port side, throwing Dory against a bulkhead. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes, the smell of burning oil filled the air. Men staggered through the corridors, some bloodied, some dragging the wounded. Dory grabbed one sailor by the arm. "Where's the armory?" he yelled. "Forget it, you ain't trained for that," came the reply. But Dory wasn't listening. He followed the sound of gunfire to the upper deck. The ship's anti-aircraft crews were dead or wounded. A .50 caliber Browning machine gun stood unmanned, its barrel smoking. He climbed up, scanning the sky. The first wave of Japanese planes screamed in low, sunlight flashing off their wings. He'd never fired the weapon before. But he had watched the gunners enough times to know the rhythm: feed the belt, lock the bolt, sight, fire. He took a deep breath. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see what you got." The first burst roared to life, deafening and raw. Tracer rounds arced into the sky. A Japanese torpedo bomber swept low. Dory tracked it, squeezed the trigger, and the aircraft erupted into flame, crashing into the harbor in a spray of oil and water. Another came in from the east. He swung the gun, braced his feet, and fired again. This one spiraled downward, smoke trailing from its tail. "Keep feeding me ammo," he shouted to a nearby sailor. There was no hesitation now. He was a cook no longer, he was the ship's defender. As the battle raged around him, Dory Miller stood alone at his gun, firing until the barrels glowed red, the air thick with smoke and ash. The sky over Pearl Harbor had turned black. Smoke rolled from the burning hulks of battleships, mixing with the acrid stench of oil and cordite. The air was so thick it felt alive, hot, choking, vibrating with the drone of Japanese engines swooping in low for another strike. On the deck of the West Virginia, Dory Miller's world had narrowed to the rhythmic roar of his gun. Brass shells clattered at his feet, hot enough to sear the soles of his shoes. His hands were blistered, his face slick with sweat and soot. Yet he never stopped firing. A squadron of Nakajima B-5 and torpedo bombers swept across the harbor, flying low and fast. The ship trembled as more torpedoes slammed into her hull, water rushing below decks. The West Virginia was dying, but Dory refused to leave her. A sailor beside him shouted, "You're hit." Dory glanced down. His arm was streaked with blood, a shard of shrapnel embedded deep. He gritted his teeth. "Ain't got time for that," he said, yanking the gun back to bear. He found his next target, a bomber banking for another run. He led the plane just a fraction, fired a burst. The tracers ripped through its fuselage. It burst into flame, tumbling into the harbor with a crash that sent up a column of steam. "That's three," someone yelled over the din. But there was no celebration. The attack was relentless. Machine gun bullets tore across the deck. The air whined with shrapnel. From the nearby USS Arizona, a blinding flash split the sky, a fireball so huge it lit the harbor like a second sun. The explosion ripped the ship apart, hurling debris across the water. The shock wave threw men off their feet. Dory hit the deck hard, ears ringing, vision white. When he looked up again, the Arizona was a floating inferno. Her magazine had detonated. Bodies and burning oil covered the water. The screams were everywhere. "Help the wounded," an officer shouted. Dory turned to see sailors trying to drag a stretcher through the smoke. Without a word, he dropped from the gun mount and sprinted to them. Together, they lifted the wounded Captain Mervyn Benyon, his torso torn open by shrapnel. The man was barely conscious. "Get back to your post, Miller," someone yelled. But Dory shook his head. "Not leaving him," he said, his voice steady even as shells exploded nearby. He carried Benyon to safety beneath the shelter deck, then turned back toward the gun mount, his ship still under fire, his crew still fighting. As he reached the deck, another wave of dive bombers screamed down. He grabbed the gun again, his movements automatic now, instinct honed by chaos. He tracked one aircraft, then another, 2 short bursts, precise and deadly. The first went down in flames. The second spiraled into the harbor, trailing black smoke. "4 down," someone shouted through the roar. Around him, the West Virginia burned, but still floated. Men scrambled to contain the fires, others leapt into the oil-slick sea. And at the center of it all, Dory Miller, a cook who had never fired a weapon in combat, stood defiant amid the storm, his gun smoking, his jaw set. For nearly 15 minutes, he had fought alone against the sky. When the ammunition finally ran dry, he let the gun fall silent. His arms trembled from exhaustion, his uniform soaked in blood and sweat. He looked out across the harbor to the burning ships, to the men in the water, and whispered, "Lord, don't let this be in vain." Behind him, the West Virginia began to list, taking on water fast. The order went out, "Abandon ship." Dory turned to help pull the wounded overboard, the last to leave his post. The cook had become a warrior. The air above Pearl Harbor still shimmered with heat as the final Japanese planes vanished into the clouds, leaving behind a graveyard of steel and smoke. The harbor burned, ships overturned, masts jutting like broken bones from the black water. Oil fires raged across the surface, spreading in shimmering waves of orange. Dory Miller clung to a piece of wreckage, coughing seawater and soot from his lungs. Around him, sailors shouted for help, their voices echoing across the chaos. He kicked toward a floating lifeboat, pulling 2 wounded men with him. "Keep your heads up," he gasped, pushing them onto the raft. His muscles screamed from exhaustion, but he didn't stop. Another explosion rumbled behind him, the West Virginia settling deeper into the harbor mud. A fellow sailor grabbed his arm. "Miller, come on. We gotta go." He looked back once, eyes fixed on the smoking outline of his ship. "Not yet," he muttered. "Not till we get everyone we can." For the next hour, Dory swam through fire and debris, dragging wounded sailors to safety, helping the dazed and burned to shore. His hands bled, his uniform shredded. Each time he thought of stopping, he remembered the men he'd left below deck, friends who never made it out, and pushed on. By noon, the attack was over. The silence that followed was unbearable, broken only by the hiss of burning oil and the groans of the dying. The harbor that had been the pride of the Pacific Fleet now lay in ruins. That evening, the surviving crew of the West Virginia gathered on the beach, wrapped in blankets, staring at the blackened water. Someone passed a canteen to Dory. His hands shook as he took it. "Never thought I'd see a cook behind that gun," a petty officer said quietly. "You saved a lot of us, Miller." Dory stared into the distance, his voice low. "I just did what had to be done." In the days that followed, as the Navy buried its dead and cleared the wreckage, stories of heroism began to spread, of gunners firing until their ships sank, of medics who refused to leave their wounded. But one story traveled faster than most, the tale of a black cook who had stood his ground and brought down 4 enemy bombers with nothing but courage and instinct. At first, it was whispered among sailors, an almost unbelievable account passed from ship to ship. Then the officers confirmed it. Reports reached Admiral Chester Nimitz himself. On May 27, 1942, aboard the USS Enterprise, Nimitz personally awarded Doris Miller the Navy Cross, the third highest decoration for valor in the United States Navy. As the medal was pinned to his chest, the admiral said, "This marks the first time in this conflict that such high recognition has been given to a member of his race." He did not let distinctions of color stop him from an act of extraordinary bravery. Photographers captured the moment: a quiet young man standing at attention, eyes forward, uniform pressed. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. When asked later how it felt to be called a hero, Dory simply said, "I just tried to do my duty the best I knew how." He returned to service that same year, insisting he wasn't done. But Pearl Harbor would never forget him. Neither would the men whose lives he saved. And though the nation still struggled to see beyond its prejudice, the legend of Dory Miller had already risen, a story carved not in stone or brass, but in fire and courage. November 1943, the Pacific Theater. The sea was endless and gray as the escort carrier USS Liscum Bay cut through the waves near Macon Atoll. On the flight deck, the smell of oil and salt hung heavy in the wind. Among the crew was Chief Petty Officer Doris "Dory" Miller, now 24 years old, no longer a mess attendant, but a decorated hero. He wore his promotion quietly. When men saluted him, he nodded modestly, still uneasy with the word hero. He wrote home to his mother that week. "I'm doing fine, Mama. Don't worry about me. I'm just doing my job like always. God willing, I'll be home soon." But fate had other plans. Before dawn on November 24, the Liscum Bay's decks were alive with activity. Planes were being prepped for another strike against the Gilbert Islands. Below deck, Dory helped distribute breakfast, old habits he never abandoned. He was laughing with another sailor when the ship shuddered violently. A Japanese submarine, the I-175, had fired a spread of torpedoes from beneath the waves. One struck near the ship's bomb magazine. The explosion was instant, catastrophic. The carrier erupted in a blinding flash that tore through her midsection. In seconds, fire engulfed the deck's ammunition cooking off, planes igniting, fuel tanks bursting. The blast was so powerful it lit the dawn sky for miles. Sailors were hurled overboard. Others ran for the rails as the ship began to list sharply. Dory Miller was last seen helping men escape the burning galley. Witnesses recalled him pulling sailors through the smoke, shouting for others to follow. He was calm, commanding the same steadiness he'd shown that morning at Pearl Harbor. Then, a second explosion ripped through the carrier. The Liscum Bay was gone in less than 30 minutes. Out of 916 men aboard, only 272 survived. Dory Miller was not among them. The Navy listed him as missing in action, later presumed dead. When the news reached Waco, his mother, Henrietta Miller, sat on her porch holding the telegram, tears silent on her cheeks. She whispered, "He wasn't supposed to fight, but he did." In Washington, newspapers carried the story, "Hero of Pearl Harbor lost in Pacific." To many Americans, black and white alike, Dory Miller's death was a wound. To others, it was a revelation. For the first time, millions saw the face of a black man as the symbol of heroism. In 1944, the Navy named a new escort carrier in his honor, the USS Miller, de 1091, the first U.S. warship ever named after an African American. Years later, historians would call him a trailblazer, the man who forced a segregated nation to confront its own blindness. But in the memories of those who served beside him, he was something simpler, a sailor who never flinched. One of his shipmates from the West Virginia would later say, "He didn't care about medals or headlines. He just stood his ground when the world was falling apart." On that Sunday morning in 1941, Dory Miller had no rifle, no training, and no expectation of glory. But when the sky turned to fire, he rose not as a symbol, but as a man who saw what had to be done and did it. From cook to combatant, from sailor to legend, his story became more than history. It became proof that heroism knows no rank, no color, and no boundaries. Even now, the waves of Pearl Harbor whisper his name. A quiet voice carried across the Pacific, reminding the world that courage can rise from the most unexpected places.